It looked harmless, almost delicate, even something that might belong on a table beside a loaf of bread or a jug of wine. Maybe you'd even pick it up, curious, turning it in your hands as you wonder what it's for. But in the Middle Ages, that innocent-looking object might be the last thing you ever touched, because the medieval world was full of tools that didn't look dangerous until they were. And the one we're talking about today, it's a torture device so deceptive, so ingeniously cruel, that its appearance was part of the horror. It was designed to lull victims, to disguise pain beneath a mask of simplicity. Now imagine you're in a dimly lit chamber. The air is thick with smoke from torches that burn low against the stone walls, chains hang loosely from iron hooks, and the faint echo of dripping water bounces around the room. You've been accused maybe of theft, blasphemy, witchcraft, or even gossiping against the wrong noble. And sitting on a wooden table in front of you is this small, harmless-looking object. It could be a pear. Not a fruit, of course, but shaped like one, smooth, metallic, elegant even. It doesn't look threatening. There are no spikes, no blades, no dripping blood. Just a strange curiosity. Your captor picks it up casually. He turns a small screw at the base, and suddenly the pear begins to open slowly, mechanically, like a blooming flower made of steel. Each petal unfurls outward, creating a widening cavity of pain. This is the pear of anguish, used across Europe from the late Middle Ages into the early modern period. It became one of the most feared instruments of punishment, and its real horror wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Victims didn't understand it until it was too late. Some were told it was a device for truth. Others, that it was a tool for healing. But once it was inserted, everything changed. You see, the pear of anguish wasn't just one device, it had variations for different crimes. The oral pear was forced into the mouth of liars, heretics, and blasphemers. The rectal pear was reserved for accused homosexuals or criminals deemed obscene. And the vaginal pear, one of the cruelest of all, was used on women accused of witchcraft or adultery. The mechanism was simple, yet brutal. A screw or key would be turned slowly, expanding the metal leaves inside the victim's body, tearing tissue, crushing organs, and causing excruciating internal damage. And the worst part? Often, it wasn't used to kill. It was used to break, to silence. Now imagine the mindset of someone in that room, not just the victim, but the torturer. Medieval justice wasn't about fairness or evidence. It was about confession, fear, and public control. The goal wasn't to find truth, it was to create submission. Picture this. A hooded interrogator speaking calmly, almost politely, as he turns the screw. The victim's muffled screams echo off the walls. No fire, no whipping, just a quiet, mechanical sound, a slow grinding of gears, and the suffocating realization that this harmless tool is designed to destroy you from the inside out. And yet what made it truly terrifying was how symbolic it was of the world that created it. Because the Middle Ages weren't just a time of castles and knights. They were an age where pain was policy, where punishment had to be seen, felt, and feared by everyone. You didn't need to be guilty to suffer. You only needed to be unlucky. Many of these devices were crafted by skilled metalworkers, the same people who made weapons, armor, and church bells. The irony is chilling. Hands that forged tools for faith and defense also made instruments of agony. But how did such a tool come to exist in the first place? Why create something that looked like a fruit, only to twist it into a symbol of inhuman cruelty? To understand that, you have to look at the mindset of medieval Europe, a world obsessed with sin, purity, and control. The church wielded immense power, and confessions, even forced ones, were seen as proof of divine justice. Torture wasn't just accepted, it was sanctified. Inquisition manuals even described methods for extracting truths of the soul. And the pear of anguish, with its quiet efficiency, fit that philosophy perfectly. It left little external evidence, meaning victims could be punished, interrogated, or silenced, without leaving the gruesome marks that might shame the church or the court. It was the perfect tool for hypocrisy, a weapon of moral righteousness wrapped in the illusion of civility. But while the pear is infamous today, it was far from the only device that looked deceptively innocent. There were chairs that appeared ornate, but were lined with hidden spikes, iron collars that doubled as shackles, and masks that punished humiliation itself. And that's where our story deepens, because medieval torture wasn't always about blood and bones. Sometimes it was about the mind, the humiliation, the fear, the performance of punishment. So let's step deeper into that world. Imagine being taken not to a dungeon but to a public square. The sound of a crowd swelling, the air electric with morbid anticipation. You're not being tortured for information, you're being punished for spectacle. And that spectacle could be even worse than the dungeon, because medieval justice thrived on fear, and fear is most powerful when it looks ordinary. Now picture this. You've survived the dungeon. Somehow you avoided the rack, the thumbscrews, and maybe even the pair of anguish, but you're not free, not yet, because in the Middle Ages, justice wasn't always carried out behind stone walls and flickering torches. Sometimes it was meant to be seen. Imagine being dragged out into the daylight, your eyes squinting after days in the dark. The town square is crowded, men, women, even children, all waiting for their daily dose of entertainment. The smell of baked bread mixes with the scent of sweat and fear. And at the center of it all stands you, a wooden platform, iron shackles, a heavy mask, cold and clumsy, clamped onto your face. At first you don't understand what's happening. You're not being whipped or burned. There's no blood, no screaming, just laughter, pointing, mockery. You've been sentenced to wear the shame mask, one of medieval Europe's cruelest yet most bizarre punishments. These masks came in all forms, some shaped like pigs, others like donkeys or birds. They were meant to symbolize your crime. A gossip might wear a mask with an exaggerated long tongue made of iron. A glutton might wear one shaped like a grotesque snout. And a liar might be forced into a devil's grin. They were locked on tight. Breathing was difficult. Speaking was impossible. Eating? Forget it. And sometimes the masks had small spikes inside, subtle enough to tear skin if you moved too much or tried to cry out. To modern eyes, it seems absurd, cartoonish even. But to a medieval crowd, it was deadly serious. Public humiliation was as powerful as any blade. You didn't just feel pain, you became the punishment. The crowd would jeer, throw rotten food, shout insults. Hours could pass, sometimes days. You weren't killed, but you were erased, transformed into a living warning. And here's the dark genius of medieval punishment. It turned justice into theater. The more humiliating the show, the more effective it was, because humiliation wasn't just about the individual, it was a message. This is what happens, the authorities would say, to anyone who steps out of line. Let's pause for a second and think about what that means. In a world where your reputation was everything, where your honor defined your worth, being paraded through the streets like an animal was worse than death. And yet, the medieval system thrived on that very fear. It needed people to see, to whisper, to judge. That's how control worked. But if you thought the shame mask was bad, wait until you hear about the pillory and the stocks devices that turned human suffering into a community pastime. The pillory looked simple, just a wooden frame with holes for your head and hands, but it was devilishly effective. You were locked in place, exposed to the elements, completely helpless. The townsfolk could come right up to you, slap you, spit at you, hurl insults or stones. Sometimes people were left for hours, sometimes days, their skin burned by the sun, drenched by rain, crawling with flies. The pillory wasn't about the body, it was about breaking your spirit. One chronicler from 14th century England described a man locked in the pillory for selling bad bread. For 2 days, people threw moldy loaves at his face until he passed out from exhaustion. He wasn't killed. But his bakery? It never opened again, and that was the point. Medieval justice didn't need executions every day. It relied on the slow burn of fear, the kind that seeps into every conversation, every household, every rumor. But there's something even darker beneath all this. The idea that pain could be moral. The medieval church taught that suffering purified the soul, that pain cleansed sin. So many punishments were designed not just to correct but to redeem. If you suffered publicly, maybe you'd earn forgiveness. Of course, this also made cruelty easy to justify. A torturer could believe he was doing God's work. A crowd could cheer without guilt, and the victim, broken and humiliated, was told that their suffering was holy. It's a twisted logic, isn't it? Isn't, but it explains why devices like the shame mask or the pillory weren't seen as barbaric. They were seen as necessary. Now imagine walking through a medieval town square. On one corner, a merchant shouts prices for fresh fish. On another, a juggler entertains children. And right between them, a man locked in stocks, flies buzzing around his face. No one thinks twice. It's just part of life. And yet, behind all this spectacle, something more sinister was brewing: the rise of the judicial show, where the line between punishment and entertainment completely vanished. In Paris, London, Florence, and countless other cities, executions became public events. Vendors sold bread, wine, and trinkets as crowds gathered to watch. Drums rolled, bells rang, and people cheered as criminals were let out in chains. You might think it was the executioners who had the power, but in truth, it was the crowd. Their reactions, their bloodlust shaped how justice was performed. If the crowd grew bored, punishments got bloodier, more creative, more theatrical. By the 15th century, the art of punishment had become performance. And behind every show was the same goal: fear, the kind that keeps people obedient long after the bodies are gone. Now, let's bring this back to our harmless torture device, the pear of anguish, and others like it. You'll notice a pattern. These tools weren't just meant to destroy bodies, they were meant to destroy identity, to turn a person into an object lesson. That's why so many of them were disguised as ordinary things: a fruit, a chair, a mask. The cruelty wasn't in the metal itself, it was in the deception. And perhaps the most disturbing part is this: many of these punishments were legal, official, recorded by scribes, witnessed by priests, and approved by kings. That's what made medieval justice so terrifying. It wasn't chaos, it was order. Cold, deliberate, and deeply human. And as we move deeper into this story, you'll see that these devices, these acts, weren't random bursts of cruelty. They were part of a larger system, one designed not to protect people, but to control them. Because in the end, fear was the true foundation of medieval law.
The night falls over a medieval town like a heavy blanket. The streets grow quiet, the laughter of the tavern fades, and the flicker of torches reflects off wet cobblestone. But beneath that stillness, there's tension, the kind you can almost taste. Because in those days, fear didn't end with the sunset. It began there. Every creak, every distant cry, every rustle of the wind might mean something more. Maybe it's just a stray dog, or maybe it's the sound of armored boots, the guards, the inquisitors, the men who arrive without warning. In the plague years and beyond, accusations spread faster than disease. People whispered about witches, heretics, and criminals who defied God's order. And once your name was spoken, even as a rumor, your life was no longer your own. You could be a baker, a farmer, a servant. It didn't matter. Justice was not about truth, it was about fear. And fear demanded victims. Now imagine you're one of them. You've been accused of a crime against God. Maybe you spoke against a noble, or someone envied your good fortune, or you simply looked suspicious in the wrong moment. The guards arrive at your door with torches and a scroll stamped with the seal of authority. You're dragged from your home, through the cold night, to a chamber deep beneath the courthouse. It smells of iron and damp earth. Chains hang from the walls. A single candle flickers, and in its trembling light, you see the device that looks harmless at first glance. It might be a small chair, a pear-shaped object, or a set of metal tongs. But here, everything has a purpose, and that purpose is confession. Do you deny the charges? The interrogator asks. Of course, you deny it. Everyone does at first. But in this world, denial is the beginning of your suffering, not the end. Because the medieval justice system didn't believe in proof, it believed in pain. Pain was proof. If you screamed, it meant the devil had his hold on you. If you stayed silent, it meant you were defying the will of God. It was a game with only one outcome: guilt. And so the harmless tool is brought forward. The chair of torture, it looks almost ordinary, made of wood, shaped like any other seat. But it's covered in tiny spikes, invisible in the dim light until you're forced to sit. The spikes pierce your skin, your arms, your legs. You can't move, because every movement drives them deeper. Some versions of the chair had straps to bind the limbs, and a fire lit beneath to heat the iron until the pain became unbearable. It wasn't designed to kill quickly. It was meant to convince. That's the thing about torture in those days. It was an art of persuasion. The goal wasn't always to punish, but to extract what they wanted to hear. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. What mattered was obedience. If you confessed, you were guilty. If you didn't, they simply kept going until you did. This was the reality of medieval justice, the illusion of mercy wrapped in the machinery of pain. And yet, it wasn't always physical. Sometimes, the torment was psychological. There's a record from 15th century Germany of a man accused of witchcraft. Instead of beating him, the interrogators left him in complete silence. No light, no sound, no human contact for days. When they finally returned, he confessed to everything they wanted, just to make it stop. That's how fear worked. It wasn't just the torture, it was the waiting, the knowing, the slow erosion of the soul. Even outside the chambers, fear ruled daily life. Ordinary citizens walked carefully, not out of politeness, but survival. A careless word could lead to suspicion. A neighbor's grudge could become an accusation. In some towns, officials introduced public loyalty rituals. People had to swear oaths of obedience to the local lord or church. Failure to participate could brand you as an outsider, and outsiders rarely survived long. You see, the brilliance of medieval control wasn't the brutality itself. It was how invisible it became. People policed themselves, out of fear that someone else might accuse them first. And while the noble courts and inquisitors claimed to uphold divine justice, The truth was far more human and far darker. Torture wasn't about cleansing sin, it was about preserving power, because every scream that echoed through the dungeons reminded the town above who held the real authority. Every public punishment, every mask, every pillory, every execution was a performance of dominance. And yet there were cracks in the system. By the late 15th century, whispers of doubt began to spread. Scholars, monks, and even some judges started questioning whether these methods were truly just. After all, if pain could make anyone confess, what value did truth really have? One chronicler wrote, "The tongue under flame speaks what the heart denies." Still, the machine of fear kept turning. For every person who doubted, there were 10 who believed that pain brought order, that the iron tools and the masked torturers were instruments of divine will. And so, the torture devices evolved. The heretics fork a small two-pronged metal tool placed between the chin and chest, keeping the head upright. If the victim's head dropped from exhaustion, the prongs pierced their flesh. The iron spider used on women accused of adultery, tearing skin from bone. And then there was the pear of anguish, our so-called harmless tool, a device shaped like fruit, placed in the mouth or other openings, and expanded by a screw until the body tore from within. It was small, elegant, even, but that's what made it terrifying. It proved that cruelty didn't need grandeur. It could hide in simplicity. And this is where medieval justice reveals its truest face. Not in fire or swords, but in the quiet, calculated beauty of instruments that could fit in your hand, because behind every device was a mind. Someone designed these things. Someone sat down and thought, how can I make suffering more precise? It's almost impossible to imagine now. But these tools were built with craftsmanship, polished, decorated, even engraved with religious symbols. To the people who made them, they weren't evil, they were righteous. And that's what makes it all so chilling. The cruelty wasn't chaotic. It was organized. Every law, every ritual, every punishment was justified by one belief, that suffering could cleanse the world of sin. But here's where the story takes a turn, because what happens when fear becomes too powerful? When the system that relies on obedience starts consuming its own people. That's exactly what began to unfold as the medieval era drew to a close. The same fear that kept people in line began to fracture communities, to pit neighbors against each other, to turn towns into prisons of paranoia. The instruments of punishment no longer just punished the guilty, they started devouring the innocent. And in that chaos, something unexpected began to rise. Resistance, whispers of compassion, of doubt, of reason. Because for the first time in centuries, people began to ask a dangerous question. What if pain is not proof? And that question, fragile and forbidden, would eventually shatter the foundations of medieval justice itself. The dawn of a new century rises over Europe, and with it, the faint glimmer of something the Middle Ages had nearly extinguished, the idea of mercy. But mercy, like all fragile things, doesn't come easily. It has to be fought for, clawed out of the darkness, wrestled from the grip of those who've grown powerful by keeping others afraid. The medieval world had been built on fear, fear of sin, of disease, of rebellion, of divine wrath. And for centuries, that fear had been enforced with iron and fire. But by the late 15th and early 16th centuries, something had begun to shift. It didn't happen with revolutions or protests at first. It began in whispers, scholars writing in candlelit rooms, priests quietly questioning the justice of endless pain, nobles watching the horror of public torture and wondering if this was truly God's work. In Italy, a philosopher named Cesare Beccaria would later put it into words: the more cruel the punishment, the more hardened the soul. But even before his time, that idea was already growing. You see, the same tools that once terrified entire towns had begun to lose their power, not because they were less brutal, but because people had seen too much. When every market day ended with a hanging, when every square echoed with the screams of the condemned, when children grew up watching neighbors burn, the spectacle lost its meaning. People didn't feel purified anymore. They just felt numb. And numbness is dangerous for tyrants, because when fear stops working, control begins to crumble. But the real breaking point came with the plague years. Again and again, death swept through cities faster than any punishment could stop it. The church preached repentance, but even the devout began to wonder, if suffering was meant to cleanse the world, why did it never end? That doubt, that seed of defiance, was the beginning of reason. And reason, once awakened, doesn't go back to sleep. By the early Renaissance, courts started to rely less on torture for confession, not because they grew kind, but because they realized torture produced chaos. Innocent people confessed just to survive, and guilty ones sometimes died without revealing anything useful. Torture wasn't justice, it was noise. Some monarchs, like Ferdinand of Spain and later Henry IV of France, issued reforms limiting how and when torture could be used. Others banned certain devices outright, and yet the shadows lingered. Even as the old tools were locked away, their legacy endured. The fear, the power, the belief that pain could cleanse, it all lived on. In subtler ways, punishment moved from the public square into prisons. The spectacle went from physical torture to psychological control. And though the racks and pairs and chairs were hidden, their spirits survived in the walls of new institutions, colder, quieter, but no less cruel. Still, something fundamental had changed. People began to write against pain, to imagine justice that didn't depend on suffering, to believe that truth could come from reason instead of screams. And so, as the Renaissance unfolded, The very tools that once symbolized divine authority became objects of horror, reminders of a darker age. In some towns, torture devices were destroyed. In others, they were hidden away in cathedrals and castles, buried like bones too shameful to display. Centuries later, when they were rediscovered in museums and dungeons, people could hardly believe they were real. How could something so small, so harmless looking, cause so much terror? A chair, a pear, a simple metal clamp. That's what makes the story of medieval torture so chilling. Not the scale of the violence, but its intimacy. It wasn't war, it wasn't chaos. It was deliberate, personal, controlled. Someone always stood on the other side of the device, turning the screw, tightening the rope, watching as belief became agony. And in that moment you see the truth of human cruelty. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers. Sometimes, it wears a priest's robe or a judge's seal. Sometimes, it hides behind a word like justice. That's why these stories matter, not because they're gruesome, but because they remind us what happens when power goes unquestioned, when obedience becomes more important than truth, when fear becomes law. Imagine standing in that same medieval chamber centuries later. As a modern visitor, the air is still cold, the stone walls still damp. The tools sit in glass cases now, silent and harmless, but even in stillness they speak. You can almost hear the echoes, the murmurs of confession, the clank of chains, the whispered prayers for mercy. And as you stare at the pair of anguish, polished and gleaming, it's impossible not to feel both horror and awe. Horror, because human beings made this. Ow, because we stopped. For all our flaws, for all the violence that still lingers in the world, we learned something from those centuries of darkness. We learned that pain doesn't purify, it corrupts. That truth can't be forced, it must be found. And that even the most righteous cause becomes evil when mercy is forgotten. That's the strange paradox of medieval justice. It thought it was serving God, but in the end, it revealed humanity's deepest sin, the hunger for control. And yet, there's a haunting beauty in knowing that those same horrors led to the birth of compassion, to modern laws, to the idea that every person, even the accused, deserves dignity. It took blood to teach mercy. It took centuries of silence to learn how to listen. So the next time you see one of those harmless-looking tools behind museum glass, remember what it represents. Not just pain, but transformation. Not just cruelty, but the slow awakening of conscience. Because buried beneath every spike, every screw, every scar, is a truth that still matters today. That justice without empathy isn't justice at all. And perhaps that's the greatest twist of all, that the very age that tried to erase compassion ended up teaching us why we can never live without it. The light of progress didn't come all at once. It flickered, like a torch in the dark, carried by those who dared to question what everyone else accepted. But that's how change always begins, not with kings or laws, but with courage. And so, as the last torch fades and the dungeon doors close, what remains is a warning. The torture tools may be gone, but the temptation to control through fear that never truly disappears. It just changes form. The real question is, when we look at the world today, have we really left the dungeon behind? Because maybe, just maybe, the harmless tools of our age, the words, the systems, the silence, are far more dangerous than any iron device ever was. And that's where history becomes more than a story. It becomes a mirror, one that forces us to look closely not at the monsters of the past but at ourselves. Fade out.